It began with a silence that felt colder than marble. In a dimly lit room within the walls of Windsor Castle, the air hung heavy, the kind of stillness that only follows monumental loss. The Queen was gone, Britain's longest-serving monarch, the matriarch who had ruled through war, scandal, and societal transformation. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, for all her grandeur, her final act was about to be the most personal and the most devastating. Those who had gathered in that room knew this wasn't an ordinary reading of a will. It was a royal reckoning. The polished oak table reflected the flicker of gold light from the chandelier overhead. Around it sat the heirs and bloodlines of 1,000 years of monarchy. Charles, now king, his face pale but controlled. Princess Anne stoic as always. The Duke of Edinburgh's empty chair a reminder of an era now gone. And beside them, the man who carried the heaviest burden that morning, Prince William. The sealed envelope before him bore the insignia of the crown. It wasn't large, nor particularly ornate. Just cream-colored parchment, hand-pressed and sealed with the royal wax crest. But everyone in that room knew that within those few folded pages lay something capable of shaking the monarchy itself. Outside the castle, cameras clicked and murmurs echoed across the iron gates. The nation waited. For months, rumors had swirled that the Queen had updated her will in her final year. Some said she left behind messages of forgiveness. Others whispered that she had written a letter to each of her grandchildren. And yet, inside the palace, there was a different understanding. Those closest to her knew that every gesture the Queen made was deliberate, precise, and rooted in duty rather than sentiment. If she chose silence, it would be intentional. Prince William lifted the envelope with both hands. His knuckles tightened slightly as he broke the wax. The sound of the tear was louder than expected. A small, cruel punctuation in a room otherwise swallowed by grief. He began to unfold the parchment slowly, his voice trembling just once before he found the strength to read. Started simply, almost softly. The Queen's will was practical, structured, and clear. To Charles, certain estates and possessions tied directly to the crown. To and specific heirlooms and artifacts that reflected her unwavering loyalty. There were allocations for charities, old friends, and long-serving staff members, each gift wrapped in grace and gratitude. Then came the section everyone had been waiting for, the names of her grandsons. William read on, his voice steady but his eyes dimming. There it was, to my beloved grandson, the Prince of Wales, followed by words that carried weight, honor, and pride. But after that, something strange happened. The next line, where another name should have been, never came. No mention of Harry. No acknowledgement of Meghan. No letter. Not even a sentence. The silence stretched like a drawn-out echo. For a long, unbearable moment, no one moved. Those in the room exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak. The realization was brutal in its simplicity. Her Majesty had left them out completely. It wasn't about jewels or property. It was about legacy. And in royal circles, legacy is everything. To be omitted wasn't a clerical oversight. It was a statement carved in stone. The Queen, meticulous to her final breath, had chosen her words and her omissions with surgical precision. To outsiders, it might seem cold, even cruel. But within the monarchy, every action is a message. And this message, though silent, thundered through the palace corridors. Loyalty had consequences. It was only a few years earlier that Harry and Meghan had stepped away from royal life, a decision that shook the world and divided the family. The Queen had kept her composure then, issuing a short, carefully worded statement about her love for Harry and Meghan as much-loved family members. But those who knew her well recognized the restraint in her tone. Behind that polished diplomacy was disappointment. A quiet heartbreak at seeing her grandson choose independence over duty. Now, with the will revealed, that heartbreak had crystallized into something final. Prince William finished reading and folded the parchment gently, his eyes heavy with the weight of it. King Charles said nothing. His gaze drifted toward the window where the late autumn light filtered through the drapes, pale and cold, and exhaled quietly, her lips pressed together in a line of understanding. She too knew what this meant. The Queen had drawn a line not out of anger, but conviction. Royal aides stepped forward to collect the document, but no one rose immediately. The air in the room was too thick with meaning. For decades, the Queen had been the glue that held the family together, an anchor in times of chaos. With her gone, and her will now made public within the family, that glue had finally dissolved. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious for now to what had just occurred inside those ancient walls. But within hours, the whispers would start. Within days, the headlines would erupt. The Queen's will, a final message. Omission sparks family rift. And eventually, the truth would reach California. For Harry, the news would come like a thunderclap. Sources would claim that he and Meghan had hoped for at least a private note, a token of remembrance, a photograph, a letter, anything that acknowledged the bond that once was. Instead, there was nothing. No photograph, no words, no mention. Only silence. And silence, in this case, was louder than any condemnation. Friends close to the late monarch would later suggest that her decision wasn't about punishment but principle. She loved Harry, one source would say, but she loved the crown more. For a woman who had devoted every breath of her life to duty, sentiment could never outweigh stability. The monarchy had endured for 1,000 years precisely because it put the institution above the individual. The Queen's will was her final reaffirmation of that truth. Still, even those who defended her decision couldn't deny the emotional fallout it caused. Meghan, according to palace insiders, broke down when she heard. It wasn't about inheritance. The Sussexes were already wealthy in their own right. It was about erasure. The absence of acknowledgement felt like a deliberate wound. To be left without even a letter suggested not anger, but indifference. And indifference, especially from a monarch known for her humanity, cuts deeper than disdain. The Queen had always communicated through gestures. A brooch worn on a certain day, a subtle nod in a speech, a seating arrangement during public ceremonies. Every move was calibrated. Her will followed the same pattern. Each bequest was a coded message. Each omission, a deliberate silence. Those who studied her life saw this as the final chapter of a lifelong pattern. A ruler who forgave quietly but never forgot. A grandmother who may have loved her grandson, but whose duty to the institution outweighed even that love. For William, reading those words aloud was both a privilege and a torment. He had always been closer to the Queen, molded from the start to embody the monarchy's future. But even he understood the human pain beneath the protocol. His brother, despite their differences, was still family. And yet, in that moment, the divide between them became official, recorded in the Queen's handwriting, sealed in the annals of history. That day would mark more than the end of an era. It marked the moment when the last personal bridge between Harry and the monarchy burned quietly to ash. No confrontation, no statement, no dramatic scene, just absence. And in royal history, absence can be the most powerful declaration of all. Reporters later described the Queen's will as uncompromising. Royal historians called it a message of steel beneath the velvet. But among those who knew her best, there was a different understanding. This wasn't revenge, it was closure. Her silence wasn't meant to punish. It was meant to preserve. To preserve the monarchy from endless media storms. To preserve her legacy from being overshadowed by controversy. To preserve William's path to the throne without distraction. And perhaps, in her own way, to give Harry one last lesson. One she could no longer speak aloud. As dusk settled over the castle, the will was placed into the royal archives, where it would remain sealed for future generations to study. The world outside knew only fragments of its contents, but the emotional truth had already leaked beyond the palace gates. For millions who watched the royal family from afar, the story wasn't just about inheritance. It was about belonging, about what it means to be written out of your own story by the person who once defined it. It was a reminder that in the House of Windsor, love has always walked a fragile line beside duty, and that sometimes, in protecting the crown, hearts are broken beyond repair. Inside Buckingham Palace, The portrait of the Queen still hung in the main corridor, her eyes serene, her expression timeless. She seemed to be watching, as though she knew that even in death, her choices would shape the monarchy's next century. And so it began, the new era. King Charles on the throne, William at his side, and Harry, oceans away, wondering how the woman who once smiled at his wedding could leave him only silence in her farewell. But perhaps that silence wasn't empty. Perhaps it was the Queen's final message, whispered between the lines of history, that duty endures, even when love falters, that silence can carry truth when words can no longer bear it, and that sometimes the truest expression of power is restraint. The world would argue, speculate, and divide. But inside the heart of that ancient family, one truth had already settled like dust over a long-closed book. Her Majesty had spoken her last word, not with her voice, but with her pen. And for Harry and Meghan, that word was silence. The news of the Queen's decline had first reached the inner circle in whispers, quiet enough to avoid public panic yet heavy enough to send ripples through the palace corridors. Balmoral had grown strangely still during those final weeks, the air thick with both reverence and dread. Staff spoke in hushed tones. Footsteps echoed through hallways lined with portraits of ancestors who, like her, had faced the inevitability of mortality, but never the uncertainty of succession. There was an unspoken awareness that the end of an era was drawing near, and with it, decisions that would reshape not just a family but a nation. The Queen's health had always been a private matter. Even as her appearances dwindled, her composure never faltered. She would smile faintly at cameras, her voice measured and her words carefully chosen. But those closest to her saw the quiet fatigue in her eyes, the slowing steps, the moments of reflection as she looked out from her window over the mist-covered Scottish hills. Balmoral had always been her sanctuary, a place where the monarch could be merely Elizabeth, surrounded by nature, memories, and the ghosts of those she had outlived. It was there, in those last days, that she began putting her affairs in final order. Her desk, once cluttered with correspondence, became the stage for a solitary act of legacy. The Queen, ever methodical, knew exactly what she wanted. Every document, every word, was to be her voice after she could no longer speak. Aides recalled how she insisted on doing much of it herself, even as her strength faded. The will, especially, was not something she would entrust entirely to others. For a monarch who had lived her life under scrutiny, this one act remained deeply personal. Each morning, she would sit near the window in her favorite tartan blanket, her corgis resting at her feet. The papers were laid out in neat stacks before her. She would review them slowly, sometimes pausing for long stretches, as though measuring the weight of her choices against the eternity of her reign. To the outside world, it was merely a queen preparing for the inevitable. But within those quiet walls, it was the act of a woman deciding who would carry forward her trust, and who would not. Those who visited during that time described an atmosphere both peaceful and tense. Prince Charles visited often, his conversations with her lasting hours behind closed doors. He would emerge somber, saying little to anyone. Princess and came next, ever dutiful, offering her steady presence rather than words. William's visits were quieter still. He would sit with his grandmother, speaking little, understanding much. As for Harry, he was oceans away. Communication was polite but strained, filtered through courtiers and assistants. The Queen had always valued privacy over confrontation, and so she chose silence once again. There was a particular evening, as the autumn sun set over the highlands, when the Queen reportedly dictated her final notes regarding personal effects. An aide recalled her words precisely. "Everything must serve its purpose. Sentiment fades. Duty endures." The phrase was typical of her, a concise summary of a philosophy she had lived by for over 70 years. It was also a quiet foreshadowing of what was to come. Outside Balmoral, the media speculated endlessly about the Queen's condition. Tabloids debated whether Harry and Meghan would fly in to say their goodbyes. Some royal watchers predicted a moment of reconciliation. Others insisted the wounds were too deep. Yet inside the palace, such talk was irrelevant. The Queen's mind was already fixed on what her reign had taught her. Reconciliation is not always found in reunion. Sometimes it exists only in remembrance. As her health declined, she spoke more frequently about legacy. Not in public, but to those she trusted most. She had seen monarchs before her leave chaos in their wake, their estates contested, their intentions misunderstood. She would not allow that to happen. Her will was to be clear, deliberate, unambiguous. It would reflect her understanding of her family, her country, and the delicate balance between the two. One aide later said she had a photograph on her desk, a small, framed picture of her family on the Buckingham Palace balcony. It showed a young Harry beside William, both boys waving enthusiastically to the crowd below. The Queen often looked at that picture before returning to her papers. She never commented on it, but those who saw her knew it brought back memories of simpler times, of laughter, of a family before division. Yet when it came time to write, she did not let nostalgia guide her pen. The Queen had long ago learned that sentiment was a luxury monarchs could rarely afford. Her doctor visited frequently, urging rest. But the Queen, stubborn as ever, insisted on completing her work. "There's still much to be done," she said one morning, her voice frail but firm. Even in her final days, she remained the embodiment of discipline. Every decision carried the weight of tradition and the unspoken awareness that history would judge her not for what she felt, but for what she left behind. Behind the scenes, palace staff moved with precision. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual. Flowers were changed daily, their scent softening the air. Security was tightened not to guard against threats, but to protect privacy. The Queen's private secretary handled correspondence discreetly, ensuring no document left the room without her approval. Rumors began to circulate that certain family members were asking questions about inheritance. These whispers never reached her directly, her staff saw to that, but she knew enough to understand what motivated some of the concern. And still she wrote. Each paragraph was deliberate, each sentence an echo of her values. There was no anger in her words, only clarity. She knew that what she left behind would not simply divide possessions, it would define relationships. For a monarch whose reign had survived wars, divorces, scandals, and abdications, her final act would be her most personal statement on loyalty and consequence. The Queen's chaplain visited one evening for prayer. Afterward, as he prepared to leave, she reportedly said quietly, "My peace is not for everyone. Some must find their own." Those who later heard this story debated what she meant, but for those who understood her way of thinking, the message was unmistakable. She had forgiven, but she had not forgotten. Her final week at Balmoral passed in gentle routine. Nurses came and went, courtiers hovered silently, and the sound of distant bagpipes carried across the estate each morning. On one such morning, she asked to be left alone for a few hours. When staff returned, she was sitting by the window again, her writing complete, her pen laid carefully on the desk. It was the last time she would sign her name. That same day, a courier discreetly delivered a sealed envelope to Windsor, addressed to the royal solicitors. Within it was her final will, signed and witnessed. Alongside it, a personal note, to be read as it is written. No interpretation, no revision. The directive was absolute. From that moment, everything was set in motion. The royal legal team began the formal process, ensuring the document was protected and authenticated. The Palace Communication Office prepared contingency statements for the day the will would eventually be revealed. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just quiet, methodical preparation. The monarchy moves slowly, but it moves with purpose. When the news of her passing finally came weeks later, it felt both sudden and inevitable. The announcement was made with the familiar dignity the palace is known for, yet behind the formality was a deep sense of loss. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, leaving flowers that blanketed the gates. Bells tolled across London. Television anchors spoke in solemn tones. The nation mourned, but within the royal household, another kind of anticipation began to stir. For while the world grieved a sovereign, those within the family knew that her final act, her will, would soon be unveiled, and with it, answers to questions that had lingered for years. Would she acknowledge Harry and Meghan? Would she offer words of reconciliation? Or had she chosen silence as her verdict? As the days of mourning unfolded, those who knew the truth kept their silence. The Queen's lawyers maintained their discretion, and even Charles avoided the topic publicly. He focused instead on his new duties as king, aware that the time would come when her words, or her lack thereof, would speak louder than his. When the casket was finally lowered and the last anthem sung, an uneasy calm fell over the family. The public ceremony had ended, but the private reckoning was about to begin. Somewhere within the palace archives, the Queen's will waited in its sealed envelope, resting beneath the weight of history and expectation. William would be the one to read it aloud. That had been the Queen's wish. It was not a legal necessity, it was symbolic. She had once told him, "Your voice will carry what mine can no longer say." It was a statement of trust, but also of duty. She knew that by placing the task upon him, she was giving him a lesson that could never be taught in words alone. That leadership sometimes means bearing the weight of another's truth. The days leading up to the reading were tense. Within the palace, small details took on heavy meaning. The seating arrangement, the timing, even the choice of room. Everything in the monarchy is ritual, and this occasion was no exception. The royal solicitor stood nearby, dignified in his dark suit, holding a spare copy of the document for record. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet click of the door being closed and locked behind them. William took a deep breath, opened the portfolio, and removed the envelope. His fingers hesitated briefly over the wax seal before breaking it. The faint crack of the seal seemed to echo through the entire room. He unfolded the parchment with the care one reserves for something sacred. The weight of history sat in his hands. He began to read. The first lines were formal, as royal documents often are, a declaration of identity, intent, and legal authority. The Queen's words were clear, elegant, and unwavering. She referred to herself as Elizabeth Regina, reaffirming the full dignity of her station. Then followed specific directives, allocations of estates, jewels, and private possessions. Each paragraph carried precision, as though measured with a ruler. To her eldest son, now King Charles III, she left the personal stewardship of certain private properties that would not pass automatically to the crown. There was Sandringham, Balmoral, and other beloved retreats. And heirlooms with personal history, brooches, paintings, letters exchanged between monarchs and family. To Edward and Sophie, a few items of sentimental value, a portrait of their wedding day, a handwritten note expressing gratitude for loyalty and grace. Each mention was deliberate, each tone affectionate yet formal. The words painted a picture of a woman who loved her family but never blurred the lines between affection and duty. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. William's voice faltered slightly as he read the line. "To my beloved grandson, the Prince of Wales." The room leaned in almost imperceptibly. His eyes moved down the page, his tone softened. The Queen's message to him was one of profound trust. She wrote of faith in his leadership, of his role in preserving the monarchy, of her gratitude for his loyalty and restraint. Her words to him were not merely inheritance, they were instruction, a transfer of moral authority as much as material wealth. When he finished that section, he turned the page slowly. The next lines should have included Harry. The rhythm of the text almost demanded it. Every royal will for centuries had followed the same order: Charles, then the Queen's other children, then the grandchildren. But the next paragraph began differently. It was not Harry's name that followed. It was a transition to the Queen's charitable bequests, a shift so subtle yet so absolute that it froze the air in the room. The Queen had moved on. There was no mention of her second grandson. No letter, no acknowledgement, no note of affection, no recognition. William's eyes stayed fixed on the parchment. His lips pressed together, his voice steady even as the realization sank in. He continued reading the rest, the legal sections, the statements of trusteeship and final confirmations. But the words became noise to those listening. The absence had already spoken louder than anything else. Charles sat motionless, his expression neutral but his jaw tight. Those who knew him well would recognize the restrained tension beneath his calm exterior. And shifted slightly in her chair, her eyes narrowing not in surprise but in confirmation of something she had long suspected. Camilla exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly. Edward stared down at the table. When William reached the final line, "This is my last will and testament, written with full consciousness and without coercion," he paused before folding the document. The silence that followed felt endless. The only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier above them. Finally, the solicitor stepped forward to collect the will, but no one moved. The room seemed suspended in time. Charles cleared his throat first. His voice was low, measured. "So that is everything?" The solicitor nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty, as written and sealed by the late Queen," and broke the silence next, her tone practical yet edged with emotion. "She made her choice. I suppose that's that." No one responded. The king leaned back slightly, his hand covering his mouth. For all his public composure, there was something in his eyes that betrayed pain. A father watching one son honored and the other erased. William remained still, staring down at the folded parchment. He did not trust himself to speak. In that moment, he understood what his grandmother had meant by duty above all. He also understood the cost. Outside, the world was unaware. Cameras waited at the gates. Reporters speculated about sentimental gifts and hidden letters. None of them knew that the truth inside was far simpler and far more devastating. Hours later, after the official proceedings ended, William lingered in the room alone. The others had left. The solicitor had departed with the document. The light from the chandelier dimmed as the afternoon sun faded behind the clouds. For a long time he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "She really meant it." He gathered his papers and rose to leave, but as he reached the door, he turned back to look at the empty chair where Harry might have sat. A faint look of regret crossed his face, one that would never be spoken of again. That night, as the palace lights dimmed and the public remained oblivious, news of the will began to spread in quiet circles. Trusted aides passed word to a select few. The Queen's final decisions had left shockwaves within the family. There was confusion, anger, disbelief, but also an unmistakable recognition that what she had done was intentional. For centuries, royal wills had been sealed from public view, hidden in the archives of Somerset House. This one would be no different. But what could not be hidden was the reaction it caused among those who mattered most. In Montecito, a phone rang late in the afternoon. Across the ocean, Meghan answered, expecting a routine update. Instead, she was met with a pause on the other end, a hesitation that carried more weight than any headline. When she heard the truth, the silence that followed was deafening. Inside the palace, preparations for the public statement continued as if nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was fragile. The Queen's final act had drawn an invisible line through her family, one that would not be crossed easily again. Charles retreated into his study that evening, staring at a photograph of his mother on the desk. He said little to his staff, and busied herself with royal duties, the only one who seemed untouched by emotion. William, however, could not sleep. The image of the Queen's handwriting, the deliberate absence of his brother's name, replayed in his mind over and over. For years, he had watched the rift between his family widen. Now, his grandmother's final decision had sealed it in history. There would be no reinterpretation, no private letter, no second message waiting to be revealed later. The omission was deliberate, the silence final. In the grand hallways of Windsor, servants moved quietly, carrying trays and extinguishing candles. The Queen's portrait remained above the fireplace, her eyes serene as ever. She had left the world on her own terms, dignified, resolute, and unyielding. Those who served her longest understood what the will truly represented. It was not about money or jewels. It was about legacy, loyalty, and the preservation of the crown. Her silence toward Harry and Meghan was not a lapse, it was a choice. A statement that the institution came before individuals, no matter how beloved. And so, While the rain continued to fall outside and the castle settled into uneasy quiet, the monarchy moved forward. The reading of the will was over, but its echoes had only just begun. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fireplace. The air had a heaviness to it, the kind that seemed to press against the walls and seep into every breath. William sat motionless, the Queen's will still folded neatly in front of him, his hands clasped on the table as if trying to ground himself in the present. The others had left, but the echo of what had been read lingered, impossible to shake. The Queen's words, or rather, the lack of them, hung in the space like an invisible weight. Earlier, during the reading, there had been no outburst, no visible shock. Royals are trained from birth to mask emotion, to maintain composure no matter the circumstance. Yet beneath the polished calm, something had broken. The absence of Harry's name was more than a legal omission. It was a symbolic severing, a statement that would echo through the generations. William had read wills before, attended briefings about estate distributions, even participated in discussions about the monarchy's transition. But nothing could have prepared him for this moment. His grandmother's will was not merely a document. It was a declaration. Every word had been chosen with care, and every omission felt deliberate. The Queen had always been a master of silence, a woman who could speak volumes without uttering a word. Now, in death, she had perfected that art. As the morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting pale patterns on the table, the realization began to sink in fully. Harry and Meghan had been erased, not just from the will, but from the Queen's final narrative. In a monarchy built on lineage and continuity, to be left unmentioned was to be written out of history itself. Outside, life continued. The guards changed shift, the bells of St. George's Chapel rang softly in the distance, and the world went on unaware that inside Windsor's walls, a family's foundation had just cracked. William's voice from earlier replayed in his own mind, calm, formal, unwavering, as he read the Queen's final wishes aloud. But now that same voice haunted him. He wondered if his grandmother had known how much this moment would wound him personally. She had trusted him to carry the weight of her words, but in doing so, she had forced him to deliver the very pain that might forever divide him from his brother. When the will was first drafted years before, it had likely been straightforward, a distribution of items and legacies among those closest to her. But after Harry and Meghan's departure, after the interviews, after the public criticisms of the institution, something had shifted. The Queen had said little publicly, yet within the palace, her silence spoke for her. Recollections may vary, she had famously said in one statement, a subtle but pointed response to their allegations. Now, her will was her final, irrefutable version of that sentiment, and had been the first to recognize what was happening during the reading. Her eyes had flickered toward William when the section skipped directly from William's inheritance to the charitable trusts. There was no confusion in her expression, only the faintest trace of acknowledgement. A look that said, "This is how she chose it." Charles, meanwhile, had reacted differently. To most observers, he seemed composed, but those who knew him intimately could see the tension beneath the surface. His lips pressed thin, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The omission of Harry was both an emotional and political problem. As king, he was now the face of unity, the one expected to hold the family together. But how could he reconcile a family fracture made permanent by his mother's own hand? Camilla, sitting beside him, had shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. She knew better than anyone how deliberate the Queen's actions could be. The Queen had never acted out of impulse. Every gesture was measured, every statement timed. If she had chosen to exclude Harry and Meghan, it was not out of cruelty. It was to protect the monarchy's stability. William, however, could not find comfort in that logic. For all his understanding of duty and tradition, this moment was personal. The memory of him and Harry standing side by side at their mother's funeral flashed unbidden in his mind. They had walked behind Diana's coffin as boys, two sons united by grief. And now, decades later, another funeral had driven them further apart. The symmetry of it was almost unbearable. After the reading, when the family dispersed, An uneasy quiet filled the corridors. The sound of footsteps, the closing of doors, the faint murmur of aides, all felt distant. For the first time since the Queen's death, the weight of the monarchy felt less like a crown and more like a chain. Behind closed doors, private conversations began. Anne was pragmatic, insisting there was no point in speculating about the Queen's intentions. "She decided what she decided," she said firmly to one aide. "There's no use dissecting it now." Charles, meanwhile, retreated to his study. He instructed his staff to make no comment on the contents of the will. "We maintain privacy," he said curtly, the tone signaling an end to discussion. But his private secretary noticed that he stared at a photograph of his two sons for several minutes before turning away. Outside the palace, news had begun to seep through unofficial channels. Reporters spoke in careful tones, citing unconfirmed reports that the will contained surprising exclusions. Within hours, social media was alive with speculation. Some argued it was impossible that the Queen would leave out her grandson entirely. Others claimed it was exactly the sort of quiet firmness she was known for. In California, the story reached Harry's team first. They received the call from a palace contact, the details vague but unmistakable. When Harry heard that his name had not been included at all, the silence that followed was telling. "Not even a letter?" he asked quietly, the disbelief raw in his voice. Meghan, sitting beside him, searched his face for an explanation he didn't have. The idea that the Queen, who had once adored his mischievous grin as a child, who had smiled so fondly at their wedding, would leave him nothing felt impossible. Yet here it was fact undeniable. The will had been read, and his name had not been there. For Meghan, the omission stung differently. It wasn't about money or material gifts. It was about acknowledgement. A letter, even a single line, would have been enough. A gesture that said, "You were part of my family," but the absence said something else entirely. That whatever bridges had once connected them had been burned, and no royal pardon would rebuild them. In Montecito, the silence between Harry and Meghan grew heavier. She asked him if he thought it was intentional. He hesitated before answering. "She always did what she thought was best for the crown," he finally said. It was an answer that explained everything and nothing at once. Meanwhile, inside Windsor, William sat with his thoughts long after everyone had gone. The envelope, now resealed and archived, seemed to haunt him. He replayed every line he had read, every pause, every omission. He wondered if his grandmother had foreseen the pain it would cause. Yet he also knew that she had always believed pain was sometimes necessary to preserve principle. The next morning, as dawn broke over the castle, the first newspapers began printing speculative headlines. "The Queen's final act of discipline," one read. "Harry and Meghan left out entirely," claimed another. Palace officials refused to confirm or deny, adhering to the Queen's order of confidentiality. But by then, the truth no longer needed confirmation. The omission had already spoken for itself. By afternoon, the royal family reconvened for a private meeting with advisors. The king was firm. There will be no public statement. He knew that any defense of the Queen's decision would only fan the flames. Silence, as always, would protect them better than words. Yet that silence did nothing to ease the private tension. At dinner, conversation was sparse. The staff served quietly, and made a few attempts at small talk. William barely responded. Charles stared at his plate. Camilla tried to offer a few words of reassurance, but none seemed to land. The Queen's final act had drawn a line none of them could erase. Later that night, William walked alone through the halls of Windsor. The portraits of past monarchs seemed to follow him with their painted eyes: Victoria, George VI, Elizabeth II. He thought of the continuity they represented, the centuries of power and restraint. And yet, beneath that lineage, there were always fractures. The royal family was not immune to pain. It merely hid it behind tradition. He paused before his grandmother's portrait once more. The artist had captured her perfectly. Her calm gaze, the faint smile that suggested she knew more than she ever said. William whispered softly, "You didn't leave him anything, did you? Not even a word." The painting, of course, did not answer. Outside, the bells of the chapel tolled once for the late queen. Inside, the echoes of her decision continued to reverberate. In her final act, she had reaffirmed what she had always stood for: that duty must come before emotion, and the monarchy before personal ties. But for those who lived beneath that crown, the cost of such devotion was measured not in jewels or estates, but in silence and loss. In the days following the reading, the Queen's will was secured under royal protection, locked away in a private archive where only a handful of trusted advisors could access it. But even as the document disappeared behind layers of tradition and secrecy, its effects rippled outward like waves in still water. Inside the palace, the Queen's choices became the subject of quiet conversations. William understood immediately what this meant. The desk represented work, the symbol of continuity and responsibility. The diary represented reflection, the ability to lead without losing one's humanity. The letters represented loyalty, the understanding that love, whether personal or national, must be sustained through sacrifice. Together, they were a blueprint for kingship. Yet, the same clarity that defined her gifts also underscored the void left by omission. There were no mementos for Harry, no letter sealed for California, no trinket, no gesture, not even a photograph set aside in his name. Those who reviewed the will later said it was not merely that he had been excluded, it was that there was no space left for him at all. His absence had been folded into the Queen's design as neatly as her words on the page. Some within the palace defended her choice as logical. Harry had separated himself from royal duties. Therefore, he was not to be included in the division of royal heirlooms. Others saw it differently. To them, the omission went beyond protocol, it was deeply personal. The Queen had always believed in the idea that family and institution were intertwined, inseparable. In her view, stepping away from one meant stepping away from both. For historians, this was perhaps the most defining moment of her legacy. The Queen had lived long enough to see the monarchy challenged from within and without. She had endured public criticism, generational shifts, and political upheavals. Yet through it all, she had remained consistent in one belief: that the monarchy existed not for the individuals who wore the crown but for the continuity it represented. Her will was the written embodiment of that conviction. Outside the palace, speculation grew about what exactly she had left behind. The public knew only fragments. The official statement released by the royal lawyers mentioned charitable donations, personal gifts, and private considerations. But it was the leaks, the whispers from within royal circles, that truly captured public imagination. Newspapers printed stories about the jewelry allocations, the estates, and the personal notes. Some questioned the fairness. Others admired her resolve. But the most talked about detail was always the same: the exclusion of Harry and Meghan. In Montecito, Harry read the early reports in silence. He knew the palace wouldn't confirm anything, but he didn't need them to. The truth had already reached him through private channels. He sat with the newspaper folded beside him, staring out at the California sunlight, thinking of Balmoral, the scent of pine trees, the sound of his grandmother's laughter echoing across the halls. The memory was sharp, bittersweet. To be written out of her will felt like being written out of that world entirely. Meghan tried to console him, but her own expression betrayed disbelief. She couldn't understand how someone so meticulous, so aware of the emotional resonance of her actions, could have chosen silence. Yet, in her heart, she knew it was not impulsive. The Queen had never acted out of temper or vengeance. Her omission had been a statement of principle, a closing of a chapter that, to her, had already ended years before. Meanwhile, within the palace, William and Charles found themselves in quiet reflection. The Queen's gifts to each of them had not been mere gestures. They were instructions, lessons left behind. For Charles, it was the letter, the estates, and the implicit reminder that his reign must balance continuity with compassion. For William, it was the diary and the desk, the tangible tools of leadership. And later remarked to a close friend that the Queen's will was her final speech, without the need for applause. It was a sentiment that captured its essence. The Queen had spoken not with sentimentality but with purpose. Her love was evident not in words, but in the order she left behind. The more they studied her allocations, the more they realized each gift formed part of a larger pattern. It was almost mathematical in its precision. Each recipient represented an aspect of her reign: duty, service, discretion, endurance. Each omission underscored the values she wanted the monarchy to carry forward. Even the charitable allocations were telling. The Queen had donated portions of her personal fortune to organizations devoted to military families, rural preservation, and youth education, causes that reflected her lifelong priorities. Notably absent were any charities connected to Hollywood or social activism. The message was clear: her loyalty lay with the quiet work of duty, not the spectacle of visibility. When the royal advisors summarized the will's key points for archival purposes, one phrase reportedly stood out from her written notes: "The measure of a reign is not in wealth given, but in example left." Those words encapsulated everything she believed. To her, legacy was not about inheritance but about influence. In the months that followed, those words would become prophetic. Public sympathy leaned heavily toward the monarchy. Many saw the Queen's will not as an act of rejection, but as a reaffirmation of her principles. Yet, for Harry, the pain of exclusion was not soothed by public opinion. Every mention of her legacy of strength felt like a reminder that he no longer had a place within it. For William, however, the experience had the opposite effect. Reading her words aloud, receiving her tokens of trust, and witnessing her unflinching discipline had cemented in him an understanding that leadership was not about affection. It was about endurance. He began to see his grandmother not just as the monarch who had raised him, but as the architect of the path he would now walk. Her will had left behind no room for ambiguity. Every gesture was final, every silence intentional. Even in death, the Queen had orchestrated control with the same quiet authority that had defined her life. As the days turned into weeks and the palace returned to its routine rhythm, the effects of her choices lingered like a ghost. The jewels glistened in their new cases. The diaries rested in secure drawers. The letter to Charles remained unopened to the world. And somewhere in the archives, the parchment of her will rested under lock and key, its ink dry, but its message eternal. The Queen had not spoken with malice. She had simply spoken as she always had, with purpose, restraint, and an unwavering sense of what must endure. Her gifts, her omissions, her silences, all told the same story. The monarchy would survive even if the family did not. The Queen's omission of Harry and Meghan from her will was not an accident, nor was it a fleeting decision made in the haze of declining health. It was intentional, measured, and written with the same precision that had governed her 70 years on the throne. To understand it, one had to understand her, not just the monarch but the woman behind the crown. The Queen's choices were never impulsive. They were rooted in calculation, principle, and preservation. She had weathered every storm the monarchy could face: wars, scandals, divorces, betrayals, and yet she had never allowed her personal feelings to dictate her public actions. The will, however, was where both collided: the personal and the institutional, the grandmother and the sovereign. To many who read it, her silence toward Harry and Meghan spoke louder than words. It was not an omission born of spite but of conviction. A conviction that loyalty, once broken publicly, could not coexist with royal privilege. In the Queen's world, duty was not merely expected, it was sacred, and in her eyes, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had walked away from it. In the months following their departure from royal life, the Queen had maintained a measured dignity. Her public statement, brief but meaningful, had expressed affection and regret. "Harry, Meghan, and Archie will always be much-loved members of my family." But behind those carefully chosen words lay a private truth, the kind that never made headlines but defined the Queen's inner code. Love was one thing, trust was another, and once trust was fractured, it could not easily be mended. Her aides often remarked that the Queen viewed the monarchy as a tapestry, each thread representing generations of duty and sacrifice. To pull one thread carelessly was to risk unraveling the entire pattern. When Harry and Meghan stepped away, airing grievances on global television, the Queen saw not rebellion but exposure. For her, the crown's greatest weapon was discretion, and its greatest enemy was spectacle. The moment Harry and Meghan chose to speak publicly about the royal household, their struggles, their pain, their sense of alienation, something shifted irreversibly. To the public, their candor was courageous. To the Queen, it was dangerous. It broke the ancient, unwritten rule of royal life, that grievances are handled privately, behind closed doors, never under the light of cameras. And so, by the time she began revising her will, she knew exactly what she intended to say and what she would not. Her omission was her final boundary, a silent line drawn to mark the difference between family and institution, between love and loyalty. It was said that she had spoken briefly about it with her private secretary. "It must be clean," she told him. "It must be final. No ambiguity, no loopholes, no room for interpretation." Her words would be plain, her silence deliberate. In that silence, she was sending a message not just to Harry, but to the future of the monarchy. That actions have consequences, even among the royal bloodline. The Queen had always understood the power of precedent. Every monarch leaves a model for the next to follow. To ignore disobedience or disregard would set a tone of weakness that could echo for generations. Her forebears had dealt with similar dilemmas: Edward VIII's abdication for love, Margaret's forbidden romance, Charles's scandal with Diana, but none had handled it with her brand of calm discipline. She believed that mercy without boundaries breeds chaos. Thus, when she sat before her desk in Balmoral to finalize her testament, the choice was already made. She had forgiven Harry privately, perhaps even pitied him, but forgiveness did not mean restoration. In her eyes, he had chosen another life. He had walked away not only from the titles and duties, but from the silent oath that every Windsor inherits, the commitment to the crown before the self. Meghan's role in this decision was perhaps even more significant. To the Queen, Meghan represented a force of independence that the monarchy could never fully absorb. Intelligent, media-savvy, and unrestrained by protocol, Meghan had challenged the royal structure in a way few outsiders ever had. The Queen admired strength, but she mistrusted disruption. To her, Meghan was both, a woman of resolve whose sense of individuality conflicted with the monarchy's collective identity. Behind palace doors, it was whispered that the Queen respected Meghan's intellect but feared her influence. In the monarchy, personality could be as destabilizing as politics. The institution relied on balance, on maintaining mystery, distance, and dignity. Meghan's openness, her willingness to voice grievances, was antithetical to everything the Queen stood for. The Queen believed in endurance through silence. Meghan believed in liberation through speech. It was an irreconcilable difference. There were moments when reconciliation seemed possible. The Queen had invited Harry and Meghan to join family events even after their departure, extending gestures of grace that few expected. But each time, the gulf between them seemed wider. The trust that once defined their relationship had been replaced by caution. Every conversation felt like it might become a headline. Every kindness risked interpretation. When she prepared her will, the Queen reportedly spoke with her private chaplain about forgiveness. "One must forgive," she said softly, "but one must not forget what forgiveness costs." That statement captured the essence of her philosophy. Forgiveness, for her, was not emotional, it was structural. It meant letting go of anger, not consequence. The exclusion of Harry and Meghan was not her refusal to love them. It was her refusal to endorse their choices. To include them in her final testament, after all they had rejected, would have blurred the line she had spent her life defending. The monarchy could not bend to individual desire. It had to stand firm, even when that firmness broke hearts. In her private notes, there was one line that later drew particular attention among her advisors. "Those who choose their own path must walk it." It was brief, elegant, and entirely her. It said everything without bitterness. The Queen's decision also reflected an understanding of optics. She knew her will would not be made public, but she also knew its details would inevitably reach beyond palace walls. In her lifetime, she had seen how even private actions became symbolic once attached to the crown. By leaving Harry and Meghan out, she ensured her silence would become a statement, one that future generations could interpret as both lesson and warning. Royal historians would later argue that this omission was her final act of governance. The Queen had always been a master of controlled messages. Where others gave speeches, she gave gestures. Where others argued, she acted. In her final silence, she had done what no press release or statement could achieve. She had drawn a permanent distinction between the monarchy as an institution and the individuals who chose to step outside it. But inside the royal family, the human cost of that decision was immense. William, who had read the will aloud, carried the knowledge of his grandmother's reasoning like a secret burden. He understood her motives, he even shared them to an extent, but he could not escape the emotional gravity of what it meant. His brother, once his closest confidant, was now a man on the other side of history. The omission had not just divided inheritance. It had divided memory. Charles, too, found himself caught between understanding and sorrow. He had lived long enough to know the weight of royal expectation and the loneliness it brought. He recognized the reasoning behind his mother's decision, yet as a father, he felt its cruelty. To see one son honored and the other erased tore at his conscience. But he also knew the Queen had done what she believed necessary, and he, bound by her example, could not undo it. In California, Harry and Meghan were forced to confront what the omission truly meant. To the world, they were successful media figures, philanthropists, independent personalities. But privately, the Queen's silence struck deeper than any public criticism ever could. It was the final confirmation that their chapter within the royal narrative had closed permanently. There would be no olive branch, no secret message of reconciliation hidden in her final words. Meghan's response, according to those close to her, was one of disbelief followed by quiet resolve. "Then we build our own legacy," she reportedly told Harry. Yet, the tremor in her voice betrayed something deeper, a wound not of anger, but of sadness. She had always known acceptance from the monarchy was conditional, but she had not expected the Queen's farewell to be so absolute. Harry's reaction was quieter still. Friends described him as withdrawn, reflective, torn between grief and guilt. He spoke little about the will, but those around him could sense its weight. For all the tension and distance of recent years, the Queen had been his anchor, a symbol of stability in a family that often felt divided. To lose her was one thing. To realize she had left him nothing was another. Back in London, royal insiders debated what the Queen's omission would mean for the monarchy's image. Some saw it as an act of strength, proof that even personal emotion could not sway her devotion to the crown. Others feared it would cement the narrative of cruelty, painting the royal family as cold and unforgiving. Yet, to those who had known her longest, the Queen's choice was consistent with the code she had always lived by. Never explain, never complain, never compromise duty. The will became her final act of control. Even in death, she had dictated the terms of her story. There was, however, one final detail known only to her closest staff, a detail never released to the press. Among the personal papers she left behind was a single line written in her private diary, dated several months before her passing. It read simply, "History is not kind to those who choose themselves." That sentence, stark and haunting, would come to define how her omission was remembered. It was not vindictive, it was historical, almost prophetic. The Queen saw herself not as a participant in a family dispute, but as the guardian of a 1,000-year legacy. Her decisions were not about emotion. They were about preservation. To many, that was what made her both admired and feared. She loved her family, but she loved the monarchy more. And in her final act, she chose the latter. The omission of Harry and Meghan was not a rejection of blood. It was the affirmation of crown. It was her reminder to those who would follow that the monarchy cannot survive if it bends to individual will. Her silence had become her final lesson. The Queen had spoken, not in words, but in absence. And in that absence, the future of the monarchy was both secured and scarred. The call came in mid-afternoon, when the light in the Montecito kitchen goes honey-soft and the ocean looks like brushed metal beyond the eucalyptus trees. Meghan was rinsing raspberries in a colander, the stream pattering against the steel sink, when the phone on the counter buzzed with the gentle insistence of a calendar alert. It wasn't a calendar alert. It was a London number routed through a secure line, the one that only ever rang when something old and royal needed to intrude on something new and self-invented. She dried her hands on a linen towel and answered. The delay across the Atlantic created a heartbeat of silence before a familiar, careful voice said her name. No introduction, no cushioning, only the tone that meant there would be no pleasantries today. She listened. The raspberries bled pink across the sieve. Not a word, the voice said. No mention, no letter, no token. The will had been read at Windsor, and the Queen's final pages had moved past their names as if turning a corner on a quiet street. The first sensation was not anger. It was vertigo, a loss of up and down. Air pressed in at her temples. She put the colander down too fast. Berries scattered, rolling across marble like tiny red marbles. She didn't chase them. She just breathed, once, then again, and said thank you to the voice, and then the line went quiet, leaving only the low hum of the range and the distant sound of a leaf blower on the next property. She stood for a long moment with her palms flat on the countertop. The stone was cool and real and indifferent. Harry found her there. He'd been on the patio answering emails about a foundation event in Santa Barbara, the usual coordinate this and can we confirm that, and he walked in smiling, saying something about a school partnership. Then he saw her face, the raspberries, the phone turned face down like a closed eye. What? He said, but softly, as if the room were a church. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't lean on the counter as if fainting. She didn't perform. She told him the facts as they had been told to her. The reading, the omissions, the transition from one paragraph to the next like a train.